like I've been saying, I would be remiss if I didn't recommend, again, aligning with the top marketing goals in the first place of your business. This is incredibly critical if you work at an enterprise level. Of course, it might be more difficult if you work in agency because communication with developers and the client is often cut short. In many cases. In this scenario, if you work in agency, probably you should push back to the developers, push back to the clients, get down the rabbit hole, make sure you get some answer as to why the website is built in React. What's the main goal as well? Make sure to liaise with your clients to properly understand what's the SEO value they are trying to pivot from within their marketing strategy. If the SEO channel is a critical touch point, then you can go on and obviously adjust your communication, adjust your SEO strategy to that. If it's probably not, well, maybe it's not even worth it to go down the route of promoting and endorsing fiercely for a change from client-side routing to server-side routing, because it implies so much effort and the cost could be quite pricey as well. On a more practical note, I would end up like that. Try to evaluate, how many pages on your site are client-side routed. Try to give a percentage. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Based on that, you can start thinking in terms of trade-off and, adjust your SEO recommendation, which could really vary. I would be talking for hours and hours, but obviously we don't have time for that. So try to do an evaluation like that in the first place, I would say. I'm Simone De Palma, and this is SEO in 2026.
Simone, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
My number one SEO tip for 2026 is to align with marketing goals, and only then make sure to challenge anything that is client-side routed or client-side rendered, especially within React web-based apps.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Shall we start off with client-side routed or client-side rendered? What does that mean, and what impact does that have on SEO?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start from client-side routing, but to start with, I think it's more convenient to make sure that everyone becomes familiar with routing. What is exactly routing? So routing means essentially how the website itself is able to create some URL path that obviously are going to allow users to change pages from a page template to another one. And this routing bit can be a bit problematic for SEO when it happens exclusively on the client side, which means the generation of new URL path when you click a link only happens within the browser. So to give you an example, imagine that you land on a category page with plenty of filter to refine your customer journey, and you can toggle on a filter or, click on a link, but the URL doesn't change. So that means that no server request is being produced, which in turn means that search engines and users as well will not have any idea that
your content's been loaded.
Exactly, is being loaded. So this is client-side routing, and these may pose a few issues with crawling and indexation. The actual blocker for rendering comes as the same page in the example I've just given to you. So now I'm going to talk more extensively on why client-side rendering can be a blocker as well. Now, like I said, while this client-side routing is more can affect much more the crawling, the discovery of search engines and indexation, client-side rendering, well, as it say the words, it impacts much more rendering. So what happens here? If you're landing on the same category page of our example, it might take some time, especially if we're talking about web apps that are based in React, because something that also has to be said now is that, React is a JavaScript library, is basically a pre-packaged library that makes it actually quite difficult also to the most seasoned web developers to tweak it, to get around, because it, like I said, it's pre-packaged, it's pre-configured, you cannot really tweak it. And React, unfortunately for SEO, is built by default on the client. So there is client-side routing by default, and client-side rendering, as I was going to touch upon now, is default as well in React. So back to our example, if you're landing on the same category page with lots of filters, it would take you some time for React essentially to gear up the page template on the first load, because during this initial load, React will execute JavaScript in the browser, causing the browser main thread to overload. The point here is that not only these will this result in a slower initial page load time, okay, of course, but more importantly, it will be hard for search engines like Google to render all the content from the page. Why? Let's say we've got a link, an important link on that page that is loaded via React. In this case, JavaScript will run in the browser to request the feature from the React codebase, but it is not going to signal the server of the request. It's going to just send an alert to React in the codebase, in the code. So if the server doesn't receive an update, search engines will be just left with the version of the page that exists in the raw HTML, and they will just render that version most likely. That's where sometimes Google might lose some critical content if you have some critical content that is hydrated, that is added to the rendered version using React. Now, I know that people can argue now that Google and search engines in general have become better, at fetching and executing JavaScript. It's true if we compare this to 5 years ago or something. It's true. But I had in my experience, I've got some evidence, at least, of some aggressive client-side JavaScript to render maybe critical components of a page. For example, back to our example of a category page, I had an issue with a client, with an e-commerce client in the automotive industry, which relied pretty much 80% on this React library to render the filter banner on the top of the page to allow users to select different options. But not only that, also the product listings showcased in the body of the page used to rely massively on client-side JavaScript. So at the end of the day, we ended up with Google just receiving pages that just look like the exact same of the main category page. So what happened is that would cause the famous indexing state in Google in Google Search Console called duplicate, and Google chose another canonical URLs. So I found that, in other words, the main blocker for client-side JavaScript is an aggressive reliance of JavaScript. Therefore, filter banners and product listing highly reliant on JavaScript to be proposed on the page. A second blocker is when you've got like millions of pages built in such fashion, so that respond positively to both client-side routing approaches and are client-side rendered. So in another example I had with this same client, they basically submitted 1,000 pages, 1,000 product pages, client-side routed and client-side rendered via an XML sitemap, but they didn't last long in the indexing, in Google indexing. They were just rejected like after 1 day or two, because, like I said, there were these two main blockers of client-side routing pages and pages being rendered on the browser. So aggressive client-side rendering provided by JavaScript is a blocker. The second one is when you've got tons and tons of pages being submitted just in one go via XML sitemap. Yet, I guess this sums up the explanation of client-side routing and client-side rendering, and how having these blockers actually can severely impact your indexation and your rendering. After that, well, of course, one could also argue as an SEO perspective, well, you would like to go all day with server-side routing if you could. Like I briefly mentioned before, though, unfortunately for us, React as a library comes by default client-side rendered and client-side routed. It is very difficult for developers to put their hands on them, for it to tweak it, to make any adjustment. It costs money as well. So it really depends, which is why actually coming back to the main message of this tip is make sure you align with actually the marketing goals. And these tips are actually can change a bit depending on on whether you're working at an enterprise level or if you work in agency. I'm just bringing up my experience working in agency for 4 years now, and I know by far that the communication with developers and as well as with marketing managers can be quite jarring and quite delayed, especially if they are not very, very much familiar with what could be the impacts of having, a website entirely reliant on React. Because, maybe they initially thought that they just wanted a website built like a portable app that user could just access really easily, also benefiting from great user experience, loading blazingly fast at the end of the day, because this is what it is. But then when it comes to thinking of SEO on their end, well, maybe they sort of ignored some important blockers that there are. And these blockers, the more time you just leave it go, the harder it is for anyone. It could be an agency, it could be also I don't know, maybe the business itself working on the app. The harder it gets really to make things right. And when I say making things right, I say, for example, to level up to server-side routing, therefore changing the routing, making sure that your category page does produce a new URL in the search bar, and therefore search engines know that there are other pages, and you can pivot from an SEO perspective. Of course, you've got more pages indexed, and level up also to server-side rendering, of course. But while leveling up to server-side rendering, may disclose some potential issues that are entirely related to how much effort is actually required from a web development perspective, and also how much money you're willing to go.
If the development team want to or insist on routing on the browser, is there anything that an SEO can improve about the way that is done to make it more likely that Google and other search engines see different URLs or see the additional content that's being loaded when the user makes that request?
Yeah, well, in theory, and now I'm not referring to any React-based app, then I'll get there later, but in theory, you could instruct web developers to pre-rendering, to pre-render that specific area of the website that is built like that. With pre-rendering, you could actually force some libraries and especially some frameworks. So we're talking about maybe Angular, Vue.js. Well, with Next.js, it's even better because it's actually supposed to be more versatile, more maneuverable as well from a developer perspective. But when it comes to React, there is no such an easy workaround as suggesting pre-rendering, because React is a different beast, is more strict. Like I said at the beginning, is still a pre-configured and pre-packed chunk of code. Basically, the code base is just impossible. It's just prepackaged. You cannot change it. So if they don't want to do anything about that, I would suggest this is where the initial bit of my tip comes in. So make sure that you align as an SEO with the marketing goals of your client. And that obviously requires to make sure you are 100% clear about them in the first place. In the second place, you must be able to communicate to the client, to the marketing manager at this point, that you can do some things but not other things. I mean, some things can be done. You should define your requirements upfront. In other words, these requirements in this situation, if they don't want to do anything about that, because maybe there are no money to upgrade to another solution, there are no efforts, because it happens that sometimes developers working with React, they might have a basic knowledge of React, but they might just not know much about JavaScript, which is a bit weird, to say, but it's actually true. So try to find a workaround that actually entails the overall marketing strategy, and then you can pivot from that. I don't know, an example, and then I'll wrap off this part. An example could be if maybe you've got let's say 10 to 20% of the website being stiff and firmly built on client-side routing and client-side rendering. For example, you've got the store locator page with all the links to other store locators that cannot be changed effectively. What you can do as an SEO, and that's something that we did on one occasion, would be to take all these URLs and try to submit them onto a new XML sitemap. I mean, like I said before, this might prove you wrong because Googlebot at some point might just reject these pages, but it might just work. And to be quite fair, it might just be the only solution you have, given that you have just maybe the store locator as a client-side rooted template.
Simone, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
Like I've been saying, I would be remiss if I didn't recommend, again, aligning with the top marketing goals in the first place of your business. This is incredibly critical if you work at an enterprise level. Of course, it might be more difficult if you work in agency because communication with developers and the client is often cut short. In many cases. In this scenario, if you work in agency, probably you should push back to the developers, push back to the clients, get down the rabbit hole, make sure you get some answer as to why the website is built in React. What's the main goal as well? Make sure to liaise with your clients to properly understand what's the SEO value they are trying to pivot from within their marketing strategy. If the SEO channel is a critical touch point, then you can go on and obviously adjust your communication, adjust your SEO strategy to that. If it's probably not, well, maybe it's not even worth it to go down the route of promoting and endorsing fiercely for a change from client-side routing to server-side routing, because it implies so much effort and the cost could be quite pricey as well. On a more practical note, I would end up like that. Try to evaluate, how many pages on your site are client-side routed. Try to give a percentage. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Based on that, you can start thinking in terms of trade-off and, adjust your SEO recommendation, which could really vary. I would be talking for hours and hours, but obviously we don't have time for that. So try to do an evaluation like that in the first place, I would say.
Simone De Palma is a tech SEO specialist at Omnicom Group. Find out more over at SEOdepths.com. Simone, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.